This is the United States, a country that faces more billion-dollar natural disasters than anywhere else on Earth. Hurricanes slam into the Gulf Coast, wildfires tear through California, tornadoes rip across the Midwest, and blizzards shut down entire states. Every year, more and more of these natural disasters are happening, and when it does, government response is usually massive. FEMA is deployed, the National Guard is mobilized, and billions in federal aid flow to affected communities. If we're to look at a financial chart of this, the average cost the US spends per year per decade on relief has gone drastically up, with no end in sight given the increasing frequency and destruction of these events. How the government's disaster response system actually works, though, has come under major scrutiny. I mean, is it even really effective? And how are these disasters actually being responded to? Well, to answer that, I think we need to look at some of the most notorious disasters the US has had to deal with in the past 2 decades or so to understand it, from the least destructive to the most. Starting with the Joplin tornado. This was the most destructive tornado in modern US history, taking place on May 22, 2011. It was classified as an EF5, the most powerful tornado category, peaking at nearly a mile in width and had peak wind speeds of up to 250 miles per hour. The tornado was on the ground for just 21 miles, but that's all it needed. Around 25% of Joplin, Missouri was destroyed, and 75% of it had some level of damage. Almost 8,000 structures in total were destroyed, ranging from entire neighborhoods to hospitals. In the end, there was an estimated 3 million cubic yards of debris, enough to cover a football field stacked 120 stories high. Accounting for inflation, there was $3.8 billion in damage, the costliest for a tornado in history. And it's also the deadliest tornado since modern record-keeping began in 1950, resulting in 158 deaths and over 1,000 injuries. The response was immediate and massive. Missouri's Governor Jay Nixon declared a state of emergency immediately after it hit and ordered nearly 200 National Guard troops to aid in recovery, with another 2,000 more on standby. The Missouri State Highway Patrol provided 180 troops, the US military sent 75 Marines from a nearby base, and 5 ambulance strike teams from the state came in too. Local volunteer groups mobilized even quicker to help with rescue and aid. On the national level, within hours of the disaster, President Obama approved Missouri's disaster declaration request, unlocking federal aid. This is where FEMA came in. Within days, they had over 800 staff on the ground and quickly set up a recovery field office. In the first 2 months alone, it awarded over $160 million in contracts to local businesses. And through directing the US Army Corps of Engineers, completed debris removal, built 2 temporary fire stations, started construction on nearly 600 temporary housing sites, and built facilities for all 8 public schools the tornado destroyed. FEMA ultimately covered 90% of the residential debris removal costs, with Missouri paying the remaining 10%. This is because under their public assistance program, they offer to cover that much of the cost only within the first 90 days after the disaster declaration to encourage faster cleanup, after which it had dropped back to the standard 75%. All of this came at a time when FEMA was already stretched thin, still responding to the devastating tornado outbreak in Alabama and record flooding along the Mississippi River that had caused billions in damages. Later, the Department of Housing and Urban Development sent $155 million over 2 years in block grants for long-term recovery. This is what it looks like when federal resources, state coordination, and local resilience all align. But this is unfortunately not the case for all major disasters, as we'll soon see. Next, we have the January 2025 Southern California wildfires. A mixture of exceptional drought, an extended dry season, and powerful Santa Ana winds created the perfect storm for massive destruction. From January 7th till the 31st, a series of 14 wildfires wreaked havoc on the LA metro area and San Diego County. The 2 main ones, though, were the Palisades Fire and the Eaton Fire. Preparations were made even before the fires began. Governor Gavin Newsom pre-positioned 65 fire engines, 7 helicopters, 7 mobile water tanks, and over 109 wildfire personnel to Southern California to brace for the historic event. Southern California Edison, along with San Diego Gas and Electric, the area's primary electricity providers, initiated precautionary power shutoffs to prevent sparks from downed or faulty wires. Since electrical infrastructure has historically caused some of California's worst fires, including the most destructive one ever, the 2018 Camp Fire. But as we know, nothing can stop Mother Nature. When the fires began, they spread extremely quickly. The intensity of the windstorm, with peak gusts of 100 miles per hour, made the wildfire spread like, well, wildfire, but even crazier. Firefighters reported that it was causing the Palisades fire to grow by 3 football fields of land per minute. Meanwhile, the Eaton fire was first reported with an area of 20 acres, before growing to 1,000 acres within 6 hours thanks to the wind. By the time the fires were contained on the 31st, there were almost 58,000 acres of burned area and over 18,000 structures damaged or destroyed. While the official death toll is at 31 people, studies suggest that it may actually be linked to 440, way higher. When doing the research on this, I saw so many clickbait titles that were trying to lure me in for the sake of ad dollars, but thankfully I started using Ground News to escape them. If you don't know them, Ground News is an independent app and a website that aggregates over 50,000 news sources. But my favorite thing about Ground News is that I can see the factuality of each source and if there's a political bias in the reporting. There's over 100 articles reporting this specific story, which is massive. But thankfully, 65% of these sources have a high factuality rating, and most of them come from the center. So you know that you are getting accurate reporting on this story. OC Register, for example, a source that leans right and has a high factuality rating that's owned by Alden Global Capital, reports it as, "Did Eaton Palisades fires lead to 440 more LA County deaths?" This study says so. Meanwhile, this coverage from Associated Press News gives extra information and says, "New studies tie unrecognized deaths and health problems to Maui and LA wildfires." It's important to note too that these ratings come from an average of 3 independent news monitoring organizations, not Ground News themselves. I love using Ground News, and I know you will too. So you can scan this QR code or go to ground.news/versed, which you can find in the description. And if you subscribe through my link, you'll get 40% off the Vantage plan, which is the plan I have and gives me full access to all the features I mentioned. Anyways, over 200,000 people had to evacuate during the crisis. The cost of it is astronomical too. While there's no official cost of the fires, I've seen anywhere from 52 billion to over 250 billion reported. So you can imagine the kind of recovery process this took. The very day that the fire started, on January 7th, California's Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation deployed 780 incarcerated fighters to assist in fighting the fires, before increasing it to almost 1,000 days later. On the 8th, the California Governor's Office of Emergency Services reported that more than 7,500 emergency personnel were deployed. But even then, the LA Fire Chief, Anthony Marone, said the county's 29 fire departments lacked enough personnel to combat the wildfires. So on a federal level, President Biden ordered the Department of Defense to provide firefighting personnel. So just 2 days later, 500 Marines from the Travis Air Force Base were deployed to assist with firefighting, and US Navy helicopters were sent from San Diego. On January 14th, FEMA opened 2 disaster recovery centers to help victims apply for financial assistance. The first step of FEMA's financial assistance came from their Serious Needs Assistance Grants, which is a $770 one-time payment to afford any immediate needs like food and transportation. Governor Newsom also signed a $2.5 billion bipartisan relief package for response and rebuilding. By January 23rd, FEMA announced that more than $35 million had been distributed by them to people in LA, and by April, that number was more than $2.7 billion, primarily in the form of home and small business loans from their federal partners. But if we were to look at just the FEMA grants, according to an analysis by LAist, eligible survivors have only gotten an average of $4,100 in direct assistance, while the average damage costs are over $55,000. So far, FEMA assistance has covered only about 7% of assessed property damage costs, less than 1/3 of what was covered after the 2018 California fires or the 2023 Hawaii fires. There just hasn't been that much support when compared to other disasters. But this isn't completely their fault, as they're consistently being underfunded. The cleanups for the fires took place in 2 phases. Phase 1 involved FEMA assigning the Environmental Protection Agency to lead the removal of hazardous household materials, which became the largest cleanup in their history, yet took just 29 days. And Phase 2 involved the Army Corps of Engineers to clean up basically all the structural debris, which is taking a while longer. Lastly, we have the most expensive natural disaster in US history, Hurricane Katrina. The reality here is that this one could be a whole video on its own about its mismanagement, but I'll try to sum it up. While Hurricane Katrina formed on August 23, 2005, it only made landfall in South Florida 2 days later as a Category 1 hurricane, basically as something weak. But eventually, the hurricane swept through many more states: Alabama, Mississippi, and especially Louisiana, reaching Category 5 intensity, where it had sustained winds of up to 175 miles per hour. By the time it ended on the 31st, destruction was historical, to say the least. 80% of New Orleans was flooded, as well as large areas in neighboring parishes. Katrina's storm surge on the Mississippi coast was the highest ever recorded in the US, at up to 28 feet in some areas. Their entire coastline was flooded. In all of Mississippi's coastal counties, 90% of the structures within half a mile of the shore were destroyed. In Alabama, a 15-foot surge flooded parts of Mobile and Baldwin counties, knocking out power to more than 600,000 people. Even in other less hit states like Georgia, Kentucky, and Tennessee, they felt the effects, with flooding and tornadoes being spawned. All in all, over 1 million housing units were damaged or destroyed. The hurricane displaced more than 1.5 million people, making it the largest mass displacement in modern US history. There was $125 billion in damages, over $200 billion in today's money, the costliest ever for a disaster. There were 1,392 fatalities, making it the second most deadly hurricane in modern US history as well. Things went wrong before the hurricane even hit, because there was some time to prepare for it. There weren't weeks, but there were days. While many state of emergencies were declared, and even the New Orleans mayor, Ray Nagin, issued the city's first ever mandatory evacuation order. Though this was heavily delayed for some reason, there were no actual systems in place to evacuate the city's most vulnerable. New Orleans was already one of the poorest metropolitan areas in the US in 2005, so many people couldn't even leave the city. The Louisiana Superdome was designated as a shelter of last resort for people who couldn't evacuate. And FEMA Director Michael Brown had underestimated the number of citizens requiring support, so the first wave of supplies were severely depleted. Now we get to the recovery part. The Department of Defense and FEMA established Joint Task Force Katrina on September the 1st to organize relief efforts along the Gulf Coast in the aftermath. President Bush signed a $10.5 billion relief package on September the 2nd, along with sending 7,200 active duty troops to assist in the relief effort. Approximately 58,000 National Guard personnel were activated as well, with troops coming from all 50 states. On the surface, this seems fine, but it's where everything fell apart. FEMA was accused of deliberately slowing things down in an effort to ensure all assistance was coordinated properly. For example, Director Brown urged all fire and emergency service departments not to respond to counties and states affected by the hurricane without being requested and lawfully dispatched. More than 50 civilian aircrafts responding to separate requests for evacuation from hospitals and other agencies swarmed to the area a day after Katrina hit, but FEMA blocked their efforts, saying the rescuers weren't authorized. FEMA officials turned away 3 Walmart trailer trucks loaded with water, prevented Coast Guard from delivering 1,000 gallons of diesel fuel, and they even cut the Jefferson Parish emergency communications line, leading the sheriff to restore it and post armed guards to protect it from FEMA. The New York Times reported that 91,000 tons of ice ordered by FEMA at a cost of over $100 million and intended for hospitals and food storage for relief efforts never made it to the disaster area. Federally contracted truck drivers instead received orders from FEMA to deliver the ice to government-rented storage facilities around the country, as far north as Maine. FEMA did provide housing assistance to more than 700,000 applicants. Hotel rooms were paid for, there were rent grants, and they ordered over 114,000 travel trailers, creating vast FEMA trailer parks. At the same time, FEMA spends $900 million on 25,000 mobile homes, only to leave most of them sitting unused because the agency's own regulations banned placing them in floodplains where most victims lived. And finally, of the $854 million offered in aid from foreign countries, only $40 million of the funds had been spent for disaster victims or reconstruction. We don't know where the rest went. Ultimately, FEMA Director Brown was fired, and the organization was overwhelmed by the scope of the disaster. This was 2 decades ago though, and if we're to look at FEMA today, they're severely understaffed and underfunded, while they've also learned from these lessons. Many critics point to their inefficiency or overspending, but it's far better for FEMA to waste resources by doing too much than to risk catastrophe by doing too little. So there's that. Thank you for watching.